We all want to kick the Russians out of Ukraine. And we can, so why don't we? Today I will talk about why we've let Vladimir Putin's bloody war continue for over 3 years. And I will show you how we can stop him, once and for all. What Putin is doing now is no different from what Hitler did in World War II. Just like Putin has invaded his neighbor Ukraine, Hitler invaded his neighbor Denmark. So today I'm at Randahl Hede, as the Danes call it, but to the Nazis this was Jägerplatz Fitting. This was where the Nazis concealed their fighter aircraft in 24 aircraft dugouts just like the one behind me. They were wide enough to hide their deadly Messerschmitt Bf 109, which they used to attack the British Royal Air Force. The Danes never gave the Nazis permission to build an airfield here, on this protected nature site. But the Nazis just started digging because Hitler had given the orders, and to the Nazis the leader was always right. But we proved him wrong. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, more than 350,000 soldiers from 13 different countries invaded Normandy to end the war. And only 11 months later, Nazi Germany fell. Our ancestors saw Hitler's wrongdoing, and instead of just talking, they decided to act. It's because of their courage that most of us have lived through decades of peace, right until Putin decided to dust off the old fascist ideas and invade Ukraine. So my question today is, if our ancestors gave us 8 decades of peace by defeating Adolf Hitler, why have we not secured the peace by defeating Vladimir Putin? Let's take a closer look. Leaders around the world constantly call the Ukrainian people our friends. But are we also behaving like friends to the Ukrainians? Our time is not like World War II, where Hitler could hide his atrocities in the fog of war. Today, video documentation is flowing freely from Ukraine 24/7. So we know that Putin has abducted 20,000 Ukrainian children. We know that Putin has tortured thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and even killed prisoners of war. We know that Putin is bombing civilians in Ukraine every single night. But wouldn't a real friend intervene to stop all that? For over 3 years, the Ukrainians have taken a severe beating, and we have yet to come to the rescue, so why is that? Let me begin by showing you some of the initiatives that really could defeat Vladimir Putin. For clarity, I'll divide the initiatives into kinetic warfare, meaning direct military movement on the battlefield, and then non-kinetic warfare, which is the soft or more indirect initiatives like putting international pressure on Russia. In this war, one of the first requests from Ukraine was for the Allies to establish a no-fly zone. It was a meaningful request because a coalition of NATO countries had successfully established a no-fly zone over Libya in 2011, eventually leading to the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. And in Ukraine, a no-fly zone was crucial because without it, many feared Russia would achieve air superiority, making it extremely difficult to defend Ukraine. But the no-fly zone never came. Instead, we slowly sent more air defense systems to Ukraine, leaving the Allies in a more logistical, non-kinetic role and leaving the actual kinetic warfare to the Ukrainians. We saw a similar reaction in 2023 when former Secretary General of NATO, Fogh Rasmussen, proposed to let Ukraine join NATO. His plan was to split Ukraine into 2 sectors, a western sector consisting of the free regions, which would be protected by NATO, and an eastern sector containing the occupied regions, which would not enjoy NATO protection. The brilliance of this proposal lies in 2 key properties. First, Russia would be prevented from advancing any further, or they would enter the protected sector and face the full kinetic response of NATO. And second, NATO personnel could now protect western Ukraine, allowing Ukraine to focus its resources in the east and winning the war. It's quite an intelligent proposal, but alas, our politicians once again took the non-kinetic approach and instead of a NATO membership, offered Ukraine a path to EU membership. A strong political signal, but one which had zero effect on the battlefield. And as a final example, French President Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has proposed a coalition of the willing, which could put Allied boots on the ground in Ukraine. This could defeat Vladimir Putin the same way a coalition of 41 countries defeated Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 2003. But military intervention would again be kinetic warfare, and Allied politicians quickly watered down the plans to only be a peacekeeping force, meaning once Putin is done killing Ukrainians and peace has been achieved, then and only then will Allied forces show up in Ukraine. So instead of intervening, as a real friend would do, the Allies have spent 2025 defining more non-kinetic warfare initiatives, more Russian sanctions and more Ukraine support. More of the same, which hasn't stopped the war. And this is the recurring theme. Our politicians want to sit comfortably in the back of the amphitheater, watching Ukraine alone in the arena, fighting the beast. The problem with our non-kinetic approach is we limit the chance of success by the resources Ukraine has. Of course, we can make sure that every Ukrainian soldier is armed to the teeth, but we are not increasing the number of soldiers. And this is a problem because Putin can enlist soldiers from a population now 4 times bigger than the population in the free areas of Ukraine. Being the underdog forces Ukraine into a defensive fight. Ukraine's competent forces are inflicting some serious losses on the Russian military and slowing down the Russian advances. But the problem is Ukraine is not advancing either. You may recall the successful days when Ukraine liberated northern Kherson and all of Kharkiv Oblast, but that was 3 years ago. Because of the high Russian casualties and the increasing pressure on the Russian economy, our political leaders would like to think that this is a certain path to victory. And it may be, but how long is that path? Because remember, we are not fighting something like COVID-19 here, where the unintelligent virus couldn't change its strategy once we found out how to fight it. On the contrary, we are at war with a fascist regime. And every day this war continues is another day for Putin to figure out how to be more lethal and more destructive. Putin is evil and arrogant, but he is definitely not dumb. Russia is increasing its production of drones and missiles. They are inventing new weapons. They are improving the efficiency with which they kill. The Russians have hacked their way into several Ukrainian IT systems and even conducted several assassination attempts on Ukrainian President Zelensky. We say we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, as if the length of the war was not important. But it is. Every day is another chance for things to go sideways. Western leaders pride themselves of sending more Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine, and sure, these systems are important in certain situations. When Putin fires a $10 million Kinzhal ballistic missile into Ukraine, using a $4 million Patriot missile not only saves lives, it also ruins the economy of Putin's attack. But when Putin floods the Ukrainian air defenses with 600 cheap Geran 2 drones night after night, costing only $80,000 each, it's impossible to catch them all. You cannot fight archers by only catching arrows. You need to stop the archer, or more people will die. In one sentence, defending isn't winning. That is why this war continues. All of this is what I call the strength paradox. On one hand, Western leaders applaud Ukraine for being strong and standing up to Russia, while on the other hand, the same leaders pretend that we, more than 50 countries, cannot enter Ukraine and kick the Russians out, as if our strength wouldn't make a difference on the battlefield. But let's look at the numbers. For every dollar in Ukraine's economy, there are $11 in Putin's. But for every one of those $11, there are $348 in our economies. And while Putin has already stretched his economy thin, we are only getting started. And what about manpower? For every Ukrainian, there are 4 Russians, but for every 4 Russians, there are 53 of us in the Allied countries. We are the 53 people looking at 4 Russians beating up 1 Ukrainian. And instead of stopping the madness, We are cheering on Ukraine as if our moral support would somehow make this less shameful. Militarily, we are superior too. Putin thought he had the second most powerful army in the world, but as we have seen, he only has the second most powerful army in Ukraine. And having lost 1 million soldiers, Putin is now recruiting untrained prisoners, carpenters and accountants, amateurs who know nothing about war, while our skilled forces are still very much alive and ready to fight. Letting Ukraine down seems contrary to everything we stand for. In Canada, the UK, the EU and other real democracies, we are the nations who uphold international law and hold war criminals accountable. And yet, Vladimir Putin is still on the loose. It's especially hard to watch knowing that we could defeat Russia. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, retired US Major General James Marks estimates that the Allies could defeat Russia in Ukraine in just 4 days. So what are we waiting for? Our political leaders are waiting for 3 key reasons. The first is containment. As long as the kinetic warfare only involves Ukraine, the war is mostly contained there. Politicians prefer that to having a direct conflict with the Russians, potentially threatening our countries as well. But I'm a firm believer we need to move past that. Ukraine has done a formidable job of wearing down the Russian forces, and Putin just no longer has the resources for a wider war. The second reason is strategic. We benefit from continuing the war because it completely destroys Russia's ability to project power. Before the war, Russia was very active in Mozambique, in Mali and other African countries, and in the Middle East, Russia played a key role in keeping Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. While closer to home, Putin had a firm grip on many of the states surrounding Russia. But as all of that is falling apart because of this war, we can now set the agenda. Putin's Wagner forces are gone in Africa, and Bashar al-Assad's regime has fallen, and Putin is now meeting resistance from states closer to home. Some of our leaders may think this is a reason to keep the war going, but they are forgetting the important fact that Ukraine is paying the price for all this. Now the third reason is image management. When Ukraine defeats Russia seemingly on its own, this will look as if Putin is an absolute idiot who completely underestimated Ukraine. Russia will be left with a strong incentive to remove Putin, scrap his imperial ambitions and instead work to improve relations with Europe. On the other hand, if a coalition of the willing enters Ukraine and kicks the Russians out, just imagine what propaganda Putin could get out of that. Potentially, German forces fighting Russia at the Dnieper River like in 1943. That would be the Russian propaganda opportunity of a lifetime. And yes, I know there will be people in the comments claiming there is a fourth reason we do not engage, namely, Putin has nuclear weapons. But as the war has shown us, those weapons are irrelevant. Because using nukes only leads to mutual destruction. The Russians like to threaten with nuclear war, but in reality, they're not firing a nuke into Manhattan or London or Berlin because they don't want a nuke to be fired back into Moscow. Contrary to popular belief, the Russians do in fact love their children too. The war in Ukraine has lasted more than 1,250 days. Our alliance could have intervened and stopped Vladimir Putin. But instead, we have decided to only let Ukraine fight. This has achieved the goal of bearing down Russia politically, economically and militarily. But it has also cost the Ukrainian people more than 1,250 days of suffering. This is just wrong. It's morally wrong to let Putin commit war crime after war crime against the Ukrainian people, whom we call friends. While we observe the war from a distance, writing long documents in The Hague about how guilty Putin is. It's strategically wrong as well to waste all our military resources by letting them slowly trickle into Ukraine, only barely keeping Ukraine in the fight and without winning. And it's economically wrong to let Putin continue this war, a war which means NATO military expenses will rise to 5% of GDP in 2035 if we do not stop him. Everyone who listens can hear the cries. In a room where the cat playfully tortures the mouse, there's a big, powerful creature which could stop the atrocities, but instead it waits. We are the elephant in that room. What we need is another D-Day, where the Allied countries show the courage to put the foot down on Ukrainian land. To stop the modern-day Adolf Hitler. The torture has lasted long enough. And, as in 1944, it's time to kill the cat.